Now, this has created some discussion on various Russian blogs as to whether or not the Ukrainian troops who were defending Severodonetsk fled in a disorganized way, as did the Ukrainian troops who were defending Liman a few days ago, or whether instead this was an orderly withdrawal to more defendable places, perhaps to Lysychansk or possibly to the industrial facilities which exist outside Severodonetsk, as they do outside most of the big cities of the Donbass. Well, I'm not in a position to say one way or the other. What I would say is that most of the footage shows unusually little damage for this war to the residential buildings, which suggests that the Ukrainian collapse was rapid. There were some earlier reports that an entire unit of the Ukrainian army essentially surrendered in Severodonetsk, and that may suggest that there was an element of collapse, even if other troops perhaps did withdraw in a more ordered way. So it seems that the Battle of Severodonetsk is now almost ended, and perhaps before very long we will see the battle for Lysychansk. Lysychansk is a more defendable place, it's on higher ground, and there seem to be more determined, the Ukrainian troops there perhaps are more determined, and of course if they've been reinforced by the troops from Severodonetsk, then they might decide to put up more of a fight. Of course, an alternative would be for all of these Ukrainian troops, the ones in Severodonetsk and the ones in Lysychansk, to withdraw completely from these two towns, which are obviously undefendable. But, as I've discussed previously, that doesn't seem to be what the Ukrainian political leadership is inclined to do. Anyway, one interesting thing which has happened is that we now have an eyewitness account of the fighting in Donbass, in Severodonetsk, from a BBC journalist, and I'm going to quote it extensively. Now, the BBC, of course, takes a strongly pro-Ukrainian view in the war. There's little pretense on the part of the BBC in reporting the war in Ukraine of its famous balance. On the contrary, as I said, it is straightforwardly pro-Ukrainian. And this report from this BBC journalist reflects that fact. That makes this report, in my opinion, even more useful in that it does give us a fairly clear idea of the nature of the fighting in Donbass and of what Ukrainian troops are experiencing there. Anyway, the journalist in question is Quentin Somerville, and he is sending his report from Lysychansk, and he writes as follows. The title of the article is "I Watched from Afar Russia's Latest Merciless Assault on Severodonetsk." And the article goes on to say the following. I'm going to pass it in a few places. I'm going to mention one or two points that stand out for me even as I read it. Anyway, to proceed with the article itself. Russian forces have entered the city of Severodonetsk as they continue their attempts to capture the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine. One of the region's governors says that the bombardment of the industrial center is so intense that they have given up counting casualties. Just days ago, I watched from a rooftop in Lysychansk as on the horizon its twin city of Severodonetsk was being bombed indiscriminately. Shells were landing every minute on its length and breadth. Severodonetsk was burning. Now that's a contrast, as I said, to some of these film images which appear to show a large number of buildings in Severodonetsk in the center of the city still intact. Perhaps the shelling is concentrated on the industrial areas where perhaps most of the Ukrainian troops have withdrawn to. I'm only guessing, and of course I'm not in a position to judge the accuracy of all of these reports, but the films that I have seen do seem to show a large number of buildings intact. That's all I'm going to say about this. Note that the governor of Lugansk region admits that they have given up counting the casualties, which does suggest that casualties are extremely high. These are Ukrainian casualties, and his use of the word casualties suggests that we're talking about military casualties rather than civilians. And as we will see further from the report, it's likely that there are anyway few people in the city, in Severodonetsk or Lysychansk. Anyway, to continue with the article, the BBC article, Lysychansk itself has been drained of life. A few people still go out on the streets, but they are mostly deserted. Artillery fire is a regular threat. The air carried on the summer breeze is gritty with dust from smoke and pulverized buildings. Now, as I said, that says that most of the people have left. The great majority of the people have left Lysychansk. I assume the same is true of Severodonetsk, or if they are still around, they're presumably hiding in their basements, obviously staying out of the battle, which again, going back to that earlier point about the Ukrainians having stopped counting the casualties, that suggests that we are talking about Ukrainian military casualties. Anyway, to continue with the article, having failed to conquer all of Ukraine, Russian forces are now targeting Donbass, made up of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. If Severodonetsk and Lysychansk fall, the whole of Lugansk would be occupied. Here, Russia isn't fighting a campaign of attrition. It's waging a war of oblivion. And for the moment, on this front, it is winning. Sergei Gaidai, the governor of Lugansk, now says that all critical infrastructure in Severodonetsk has been destroyed. Previously, he suggested that Ukrainian forces may have to withdraw from the city and Lysychansk. The scene of devastation in a third city, Rubizhne, in peacetime just a short drive to the north, shows what Russia's unrelenting artillery fire is capable of. Looking from Lysychansk into the distance, there is now a blot on the emerald green landscape. The small city is gone, scoured from the earth. Well, we don't need to accept some of this dramatic language. Clearly, there is still buildings there. They've not just all been obliterated or destroyed. But anyway, I don't doubt that it is a scene of great devastation. To continue with the article, the way he means Rubizhne, fell some 2 weeks ago, marks an important shift in how Vladimir Putin's forces are now fighting the war. Gone are long armoured columns and tank and infantry attacks seen in the first months in favour of large-scale artillery barrages. As many as 1,500 shells a day in Rubizhne to wipe out resistance before any ground advance. Now, let's just take a step back and consider the implications of that statement. Now, the first thing I would say, and the one that really stands out, is about the intensity of the shelling, of the Russian shelling. Now, this BBC journalist, says that in Rubizhne, an important place, there's a major battle, not a huge place, the Russians were shelling Rubizhne, were shelling the Ukrainian troops in Rubizhne at a rate of 1,500 shells. That's 1,500 rounds of ammunition a day. That's just one day. Now, I'm not sure how this is counted. I'm not sure who's doing the counting. But just consider the implications of this. When the United States first decided to send M777 howitzers to Ukraine. This is some weeks ago. It sent those howitzers together with, I believe it was 150,000 rounds of ammunition. Now that sounds like a lot, but a tenth of that is what the Russians used every day in a place like Rubizhne, a relatively small place which is only one part of the Ukrainian battlefield, of the Donbass battlefield. Those 150,000 rounds of ammunition that the United States was sending with that dispatch of howitzers would be used up in, frankly, almost no time, given the intensity of the shelling that we're talking about. Now, I have to qualify this. Firstly, obviously, the United States has upped the amount of ammunition it is selling to Ukraine since it sent that first delivery of 150,000 rounds. But even then, if you look at the figures, it doesn't come anywhere close to the amount of ammunition that the Russians are using, the number of rounds of ammunition that the Russians are using across Donbass on any particular day. The second is that, of course, we have to be careful about this figure of 1,500 shells a day on Rubizhne. I mean, armies do count rounds of ammunition, so it's not impossible that the Ukrainians are keeping some kind of track of the number of rounds expended in a place like Rubizhne. But of course, we can't be certain that these figures, this figure of 1,500 rounds, which to me sounds pretty awesome, we can't be sure that this is completely or entirely accurate. But there we are. What is likely, what is, it seems to me, almost certain, and we've seen it borne out, confirmed, corroborated by article after article, comment after comment from people who've been following the fighting in Donbass with great attention. What seems indisputable is that the Russian shelling, the Russian artillery barrages are extremely intense. Now, there is another point I wanted to make. The BBC journalist seems to assume that there's been a change in Russian tactics. He talks about how gone are the long armored columns and tank and infantry attacks seen in the first months in favor of large-scale artillery barrages. Well, I've been reading up a little about how the Russian army fights its wars, and artillery barrages preceding an attack are in fact standard Russian military practice. What was happening in the early stages of the war was that the Russians were sending armored columns at great speed across Ukraine, as they say, to tie down Ukrainian troops in defense of cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, and the rest. And once that part of the operation had been completed, the Russians have simply reverted to their usual practice, which is to attack behind massive and sustained artillery barrages. If you read the history of the Second World War, that is exactly what they did then. Anyway, to continue, overwhelming Russian firepower, particularly artillery, underlines the urgent need, say Ukrainian field commanders, for more advanced weapons from the West to halt the enemy advance. The great sweep of Donbass runs along Ukraine's eastern flank from Severodonetsk in the north, ending at the southern coast around the city of Mariupol, the hard-fought-over city recently captured by Russia in one of its biggest gains in the war. President Volodymyr Zelensky said last week that Ukraine was losing 50 to 100 troops a day in the region. Well, earlier in the article we've read that the Ukrainians have stopped counting their casualties, but Zelensky did say that. The Russians, of course, put Ukrainian losses much higher. Anyway, to continue. In Lysychansk, I meet Private First Class Vladimir, serving with a reconnaissance unit in the country's National Guard. Now, I'm going to say something interesting about this article. It does quote a number of Ukrainian soldiers who are in Lysychansk. But as far as I can see, all of them, without exception, are not members of the regular Ukrainian army. They're all members of the National Guard, which is a paramilitary force under the control of Ukraine's Interior Ministry. Now, I can't help but think that the reason it's these soldiers who are giving these interviews to this BBC journalist, is because the Ukrainian authorities see the National Guard as politically more reliable, and the troops who serve in it as more loyal and perhaps possessing higher morale. Anyway, I just make that observation. It doesn't detract from the value, as we shall see, of what these soldiers actually say. So, to continue, and now we are hearing what Vladimir, this soldier serving with a reconnaissance unit in the National Guard, says to this BBC journalist. And he says the following: Russian forces are adapting. First they came in bold and got hit hard. Now the enemy flattens what it can't capture with infantry. He tells me of his month in Rubizhne. It wasn't Mariupol, but it was pretty close. Well, that's an interesting comment. I mean, was he previously in Mariupol and then redeployed to Rubizhne, or is he simply basing that on second or third accounts? Anyway, I'm not going to press that. Going back to what he says, and now he's talking about Rubizhne. It was very hard. There were a lot of losses, a lot of fighting across streets. There was also artillery, just removing those houses very fast. People would try to hide in the basements, so they had no view, no assessment of the current situation. So there were a lot of losses during that time. Is that lots of losses? He seems again to be talking about soldiers rather than civilians, though perhaps he is including civilians. I don't know, but the impression I get here is that he's talking about soldiers. And again, whilst he doesn't give figures, the overall impression is that it's more than the 50 to 100 men a day across the whole of Donbass that Zelensky was talking about. But anyway, to continue, and again we go back to the BBC journalist. The men and women fighting in Donbass for Ukraine are not inexperienced. Many have fought against Russian-backed separatists who, since 2014, have been trying to secede from Ukraine. Well, actually, that's not strictly true. Just to say, from 2015 onwards, they were supporting the Minsk agreement, which sought to preserve Donbass within Ukraine. But again, let's move on. In this new battle for the region, the Ukrainian troops, these experienced Ukrainian troops who have fought against the militias of the Donbass, these Ukrainian troops face a national army. That, of course, refers to the Russian army, one that has large resources of men and equipment. Even for experienced fighters, the volume and nature of Russian weaponry being used in Donbass is overwhelming. I speak to another guardsman, again, no National Guard, not a regular military, who doesn't want to give his name. It's not my first war, he says. I mean, that one was a trench warfare, so it's a bit different this time. When I went to Rubizhne, I saw the whole picture. It was tough, shots with high explosive fragmentation grenades, 82mm caliber weapons, he says, stopping to draw on a cigarette. Vladimir, the Ukrainian soldier, now this seems to be the earlier one, says the local population are 30% pro-Ukrainian, 30% pro-Russian, and 40% don't care. Of course, many pro-Ukrainian residents have now fled. That's quite an interesting admission. Now, again, these seems fairly crude guesstimate about loyalties in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, but we're told that only 30% of the people here, this is a member of the Ukrainian National Guard, he thinks that only around 30% are pro-Ukrainian. 70% are either indifferent or pro-Russian. BBC journalist doesn't quite follow through with the logic of that. You'll see that he doesn't actually continue the rather obvious line of questions that I would have seen from a comment like that. But anyway, then he goes on to say, and this is, I'm returning again to the BBC journalist, he then goes on to say the following. Since the start of the war, military analysts have made much of Russia's rising casualty numbers and the weakness of morale amongst its soldiers. Casualty numbers are still rising, but Russia isn't running out of men in Donbass. Nor is the Kremlin running short of artillery shells. The explosives which are hammering Lysychansk and Severodonetsk seem in plentiful supply. The surrounding countryside is marked like a pox with black artillery craters spreading for miles along fields and roadways. There's a lot of artillery, said Vladimir. Bombardments are like a nightmare. We shoot one round, they shoot 10. When our sniper is shooting, they send in a full packet of grads on his position. Grads are are rockets fired from multiple rocket launchers. More about those in a moment. So it's basically a sniper with one bullet, and they send like $1,000 of artillery rounds. They really don't care how much ammunition they use. Like Vladimir, many of the men I met in Lysychansk were previously the defenders of Rubizhne. Having been through hell once, they say they are prepared to endure it a second time. Footage given to the BBC by a unit of the National Guard shows a landscape there which could be a recreation of World War II devastation. Lines of shelled-out houses, empty streets with only corpses and dead animals along the pathways, and there's another reminder too from that war. Shell shock. Men left the town with shaking hands and limbs and constant headaches. Cigarettes and coffee are all that keep them away, said one young lieutenant called Pasha. Now, that's as much of the article as I propose to read. There's some discussion now about the Western weapons, the M777 howitzers, which there will not be anywhere near enough of to make any significant difference. And of course, there's another report today that President Biden has refused to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. So it seems that any American M270 multiple rocket launch systems which are sent to Ukraine will not have long-range missiles. They'll be restricted to missile systems that have a range of around 70 kilometers, which is no greater than that of the systems, the multiple rocket launch systems that the Ukrainians themselves have already been using, and which they started the war with a large number of. So I can't see myself how these M270s are going to make any significant difference. But anyway, the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, it's quite clear from this article, have been told that these weapons are coming and they're staking all their hopes on them. I think that they will be disappointed, and I think more and more people think so. And as I've said, I think that far from US military help to Ukraine escalating, I think it's diminishing, but we will see. Anyway, that's, I think, an account of the fighting from the BBC, and it presents an incredibly grim picture. It essentially corroborates that which we've been saying on this program, on these programs, on this channel, that which others have been saying, that there is no Ukrainian defense or response to these huge volumes of Russian artillery fire. Even if it is an exaggeration that the Russians were shelling Rubizhne, or shelling the Ukrainian troops in Rubizhne, at a rate of 1,500 rounds of ammunition a day, it is simply inconceivable that the United States, which doesn't keep such enormous stocks of ammunition, could match this to any great degree. And I've already discussed in an earlier program how the M777 howitzers are anyway not designed for massive artillery barrages on this scale, and the M270 multiple rocket launch systems are, again, for reasons discussed in previous programs and most thoroughly by Jacob Dreisen in the Dreisen report, it's most unlikely that the United States will supply many of them, because the logistics of trying to keep these systems operating in the Ukrainian battlefields are not just daunting, they are simply overwhelming. So there we go. It's a darkening military picture for Ukraine. And it's also increasingly clear that Western support generally is crumbling. Now, I say crumbling. We've now had a decision from the European Union. It's so far only a decision in principle for a partial oil embargo. This is a harebrained plan which should have been dropped, but Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission were determined to press on with it. And of course, they had the enthusiastic support of Robert Habeck, Germany's Vice-Chancellor, who's a Green, and of course countries like Poland and Finland and Denmark and the Baltic states. And the overwhelming force, the irresistible force that these political leaders represent, came up against the seemingly immovable obstacle of Viktor Orban and some other, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who was quietly supported by some of the other Central European states, and one suspects increasingly other states like Italy. And the result is a botched compromise. And it's a compromise which, I should say, Orban himself was the first to float. He said that since Hungary and other countries are landlocked, they should be allowed to continue to import oil at apparently unrestricted volumes from Russia via the Druzhba pipeline, but that they would not stand in the way of an oil blockade, an oil import ban on Russian oil supplied to the European Union by ship. Now, I clearly recall when Orban first suggested this, that some of the hardline states, the Baltic states and the rest, were saying that if such a plan was ever proposed, if such a compromise was ever suggested, they themselves would veto it, because they insisted upon a total oil embargo. Well, Orban proved immovable, and they've all agreed to it. What they originally said they wouldn't agree to, they've now agreed to it apparently in principle, though the details have not yet been ironed out. What is its effect going to be? The first is that the amount of oil that's moving down the Druzhba pipeline is now going to increase, because countries as well as Hungary that import oil from Russia and need heavy Urals crude are going to continue to need it. They won't be able to get it by ship. They'll therefore have to import it through the Druzhba pipeline. Apparently the amount of oil that's flowing to the EU through this pipeline has been steadily increasing over the last few months, and I predict this is going to continue and continue even further until there is no capacity on the part of the pipeline to supply any more oil than because the physical limits have been reached. And I've already said that despite the European Commission's attempts to try to outlaw the importation of Russian shipborne oil, and the European Commission's proposals, not yet agreed, to try to make the circumventing of Russian sanctions a criminal offence, I predict that with Greek tankers, Greek ship owners allowed still to trade Russian oil in their tankers, a lot of Russian oil will continue to be arriving in the Union by ship, except of course it will have gone through various middlemen and it will no longer be formally Russian oil. So the Russians will probably be able to maintain their volumes. And of course, anyway, they are supplying oil to other countries. They're supplying oil to China. They're supplying oil to India as well. They're supplying oil to all sorts of people. And it doesn't seem as if they're going to be short of customers for their oil. Though, as I said, I suspect a large part of it will continue to go to Europe. So a botched compromise, but it at least gives Ursula von der Leyen and Robert Habeck and the Poles and the Balts something that they can call a restriction, a ban on Russian oil. As I have said already, this is extremely bad, not so much for Russia, which will always be able to find customers for its oil. It is bad for the European Union, which will now have to pay a much higher price for its oil than it would otherwise have to do, because it has ruled out imports of oil from Russia, shipborne oil from Russia, and of course it's also imposed upon itself this complicated device of importing oil, which will essentially come from middlemen. And all of this is happening at a time when the price of Brent crude stands at $120 a barrel. It makes very little sense. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian by Simon Jenkins, a former editor of the Times newspaper, by the way, in Britain, a very fine journalist in my opinion, one of the few realists that you still find in the British media, but for that reason I'm afraid someone who is seen in Britain as something of a maverick. Anyway, he clearly says that sanctions have to all intents and purposes, sanctions against Russia have to all intents and purposes failed and they should be dropped. Well, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission, Robert Habeck, Emmanuel Macron, the Poles, and the rest, of course, they can't bring themselves to do that. That would be, in effect, an admission of failure, and they cannot admit failure. So they've now got themselves an oil ban of sorts, though, of course, it's not really an oil ban at all. It's got more holes in it than a Swiss cheese. But there we are. So what does this tell us about this overall situation in Ukraine, where Ukraine now finds itself? Well, we see that the United States is not going to supply long-range missiles to Ukraine. This has been explained as a move, a de-escalatory move, because the United States does not want Ukraine to be launching missile strikes on Russian territory using American weapons. I'm going to make a guess. The Pentagon has made it absolutely clear to the White House that this, as far as the Pentagon is concerned, is absolutely not acceptable. So the Ukraine is not getting some of the sophisticated weapons it was hoping for. Despite all the promises of arms supplies, there are clear limits to the kind of weapons Ukraine will be allowed to buy, or which will be supplied to it. And we have seen the enormous battle the European Union has had over the oil import ban, and the fact that it has ended, instead of in a resounding declaration that it will no longer be buying oil from Russia, what it's ended with instead is a botched, unsatisfactory compromise, one which isn't going to worry the Kremlin at all. So, if I was looking at this whole situation from Kiev, which of course I'm not, I would say to myself, well, we're not really going to get through. We're losing badly in Donbass. We can't hope to match this enormous volume of artillery fire that the Russians are bringing to bear. We can't hope to match the Russians in resources. We've been supplied by any number of weapon systems by the United States and the Western powers. None of them have made any decisive difference to the outcome of the war, and it is looking increasingly unlikely that they will do so. And the sanctions the European Union has been imposing on us is simply causing disputes with it, on the Russians, has been imposing on the Russians. These sanctions are now simply becoming a point of dispute amongst the Europeans and the Western powers themselves. So rather than press on, rather than continue to wage a war, which is clearly going badly wrong, why don't we sit down and negotiate and talk whilst we still can? I've been hearing more over the course of the day about the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, which I discussed in my previous program. Now, I'm not going to discuss this in detail because all of the material I've seen comes from the Russian side. But if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at pictures of damaged Russian vehicles which had attempted to cross on a pontoon bridge the Severodonetsk river in the Donbass. And I accepted that this was a defeat, and even though the footage came, a Russian defeat, even though the footage came from Ukraine. I think if I were to apply the same logic, after seeing some of the pictures and films I've seen from this Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, I should be saying that the Ukrainian offensive has also ended in a complete debacle. There are again pictures of destroyed vehicles, of massive Russian artillery fire on the Ukrainian spearhead. It seems as if the Ukrainian troops were routed. Well, I can't corroborate it. I can't definitely say it is true. But if it is true, then it ought to reinforce the views, the councils in Ukraine, if they exist, that call for compromise. I'm also hearing that there's considerable political unease now in Ukraine, that there's more criticism of President Zelensky. It was striking that when his predecessor, President Poroshenko, attempted to leave Ukraine, why, one wonders, he was prevented from doing so, suggesting that the Ukrainian authorities are still nervous about what Poroshenko gets up to, and of course they're bringing a case against him. the whole situation is beginning to look increasingly fragile. What Ukraine should do, as I've said before, is sit down and talk. End the war through negotiations. President Erdogan of Turkey is offering himself again as a mediator. I'm afraid I don't think it's going to happen. I think, on the contrary, the Ukrainians will continue to delude themselves with hopes of Western weapons, Western wonder weapons, which will turn the tide. By the time they discover, or so I believe, that these expectations are misplaced, it will be too late.